Hi YouTube, my name's Jeff and I'm the vegoilguy. Since my last video on lost foam casting, I've been spending my time picking the brains of an expert and finding ways to improve my casting technique. And look at the results. It doesn't get much better than this with foam. Stick with me and I'll show you what I've learned. Hi again guys. In my last video you saw me make a sprocket out of extruded foam using green sand. And whilst I made mistakes on that occasion, I've always been pleased with the results I've achieved. But after talking to a real casting guru, I've learnt that these marks are known as folds and are a common problem associated with foam casting. Now whilst my usual results aren't as bad as this, on reflection I know I've seen this sort of thing before. But not anymore. Thanks to my guru, a lot of reading, dozens of experiments and lots of head scratching, I've come up with a way to give me crisp, perfectly formed results every time. After my last video, I received a message from a subscriber. Amongst other things, he recommended that I look at a channel by Old Foundryman. I did, I enjoyed what I saw, I subscribed and I sent off a message. Old Foundryman wrote back answering my question and that was it. A friendship was struck up. Martin, his real name, is the real deal. He's a typical Australian. He's friendly, easygoing and happy to help. Martin is a great guy and a fountain of knowledge. What he doesn't know isn't worth knowing in my eyes. I strongly recommend you check out his channel and I urge you to subscribe. We need great sources of information like Martin. These are the real experts. So let's start by looking at the mistakes in my last video. In it I said, and I've read and heard this many times before, that in lost foam casting, the foam virtually disappears the moment it comes into contact with the metal. Well, it doesn't. It does disappear quickly and the rate it goes is dependent on a lot of factors. I previously said that extruded foam works as well as expanded foam, and that's not strictly true. Being denser, extruded foam takes a little more time and energy to burn. That's why professionals and factories use expanded foam. I recommended using expanding foam glue as an adhesive and I've changed my mind there. It seems to take a lot of energy to burn the foam glue, so I've switched to something that burns more easily. Before I made use of foam to create sprues to feed and vent the metal, which is a common enough practice, but I found a better way, which I'll talk about in a moment. Lastly, I poured the metal through sand, again a common practice, but this allows the metal to begin cooling prematurely, and there's a better way to do it. To rectify these problems, Martin encouraged me to look at the process more carefully and figure out exactly what was going on. So beginning with the foam, what exactly is happening? Remember your high school physics? Science tells us that nothing is made or destroyed, it only changes state, and that's certainly true of lost foam. Molten metal comes into contact with the foam and it begins to vaporize. The foam becomes a gas. Not only that, if I remember my school days correctly here, when a solid becomes a gas, it increases in volume. And that's critical information right there. The gas is bigger than the foam it replaces and it's got to go somewhere. It has to escape the mold. If it doesn't, it will spoil and weaken the metal. So we need to deal with this gas. But hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself. How did the foam become vaporized? The foam starts to vaporize when its temperature exceeds 204 degrees Celsius or about 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So when molten metal gets very close to the foam or touches it, the temperature of the foam rises and it begins to vaporize and gas. It doesn't instantly vanish as many believe, rather it retreats from the heat source. Yes, it's very quick, but if you've ever poured metal whilst lost foam casting, you may have noticed that lull. That moment that might only take a second but seems to take forever. This lull is a problem. Pockets of metal can be created by this lull and time is passing and allowing the metal to cool. Both these factors can spoil the process. And how exactly do we introduce the hot metal? Through cool sand, and in my case through cool damp sand. So before the metal gets near the foam, it's begun to cool, reducing its ability to flow and melt foam. So to improve this process, we need to keep the metal hotter for longer. We need to encourage the metal to flow continuously. And we need to remove as much of the gas as we can. Now this doesn't sound too difficult, but it had me scratching my head until I remembered my old friend. Plaster. If you've seen my videos lately, you'll be beginning to think that I've got plaster on the brain. And you know what? I think I have. And this is the result of my plaster pondering. a feeder made from plaster of Paris. I'll show you how to make one of these in a few minutes. Before you dismiss this as a daft idea and a waste of your valuable time, stick with me. This feeder is wide and tall, able to cope with practically all the metal that's in my crucible. Its wide mouth makes pouring an absolute doddle. It's a fantastic insulator, so metal poured inside it stays hotter for longer. The height of the metal inside the feeder adds head pressure, forcing the metal into the mould. It narrows at the bottom to deliver the metal and heat just where it's wanted. The feeder stores hot metal as it passes into the mould, and this is the last point for the metal to freeze, making it a natural riser. As the feeder remains open longer, it allows gas to pass through the metal and vent. Finally, it's really easy to make, and it can be recycled in part. The one you'll see me using has been used once before. We'll see this feeder in action in a moment, but first let's revisit the foam. I stated previously that to achieve greater detail I used extruded foam, and I still do. I couldn't make a sprocket like this from expanded foam, it would just lack detail, but as this foam is denser than expanded foam, it's helpful to minimise the amount used. So wherever possible, use expanded foam rather than extruded foam. If you can, combine the two and reduce the amount of extruded overall. Finally, and wherever possible, hollow out sections of the foam so you're replacing the foam with air. But with all this said, I still prefer extruded foam. I know it's not ideal, but I like it. I also mentioned in the last video that I use candle wax to do the odd repair. Well, you can also use it to improve the detail. Even extruded foam is bubbly and has a grain, but you can paint molten wax onto the foam and cut this away with a sharp knife. Here I'm using a router bit. I've painted all the teeth with molten wax, but I haven't gone mad. They're much smoother than they were before, but they could still be better. And don't forget, this wax will disappear easily in the foundry. Now you could use this method to get very fine detail if you have the patience. Here you can see I've carved out two gates from expanded foam. These have circular tops to fit inside the plaster feeder and vent. You'll notice how they taper down to the foam pattern. I've glued these in place, but for the moment I'm going to screw them as well. This helps prevent them from getting knocked off when sand is applied. As I said before, I've moved away from expanding foam adhesive. I did a few simple tests gluing scraps of foam together with different glues, and I passed them through my hot wire cutter. It's an easy test, but it can yield surprising results. So find a glue that sticks well, doesn't damage the foam, and that burns easily. So with the foundry fired up and melting metal in the background, let's make up the flasks. Just like last time, I start with a solid bottomed lower flask, or drag to give it its proper name. This gets filled with green sand and packed down well to form a nice flat surface. Remember, green sand should be damp, not wet, and if you're at all unsure, err on the side of dry. You can see here that I've increased the height of my upper flask. The foam pattern is added centrally. Actually, look carefully at the centre of the sprocket. I cocked up here when I was making it, and I had to cut away a small section, and I've patched back in another piece using candle wax. Wait and see if you can see the join in the finished sprocket later on. Sand is sifted initially, so the finest sand contacts the foam. Importantly here, you'll notice that I'm not ramming the sand. I'm feeling with my fingers, finding the edges and applying pressure with just my fingertips to the sand. You can feel the sand compress. By touch alone, you can identify the features of the pattern. I'm making sure I compress the sand between every tooth and spoke, getting into all the detail. But I'm not overly applying force, and that's important. I don't want to damage the foam, and I don't have to go mad with the compression. More sand is added until it just meets the top of the foam gates. Now this is compressed a little, but there's no hammering force here. It's not wanted or needed. Normally these screws come out with ease, but today I'm recording the process so sod's law applies. Thankfully it's easy to get them out, and the holes they leave behind are actually an added bonus. The plaster vent is narrower than the feeder. I cast it around a piece of copper pipe and it fits nicely over the foam gate. The feeder is added as well, and both are supported by the sand. Again, I've got to stress, I'm not overly compacting the sand. I'm not using excessive force. The gases created by the foam will try to vent through the sand, so if we overly compress it, we hinder this process. Outside now, and just before the pour, you'll notice that I've rested a brick on the very edge of the feeder. There is the potential for the weight of the pour to dislodge the feeder from the foam. The brick prevents this occurrence. One last idea, courtesy of Martin here, is to poke a few holes in the sand. You can see the metal spoke I'm using is quite fine, and I've measured it so that it never comes into contact with the foam. It's maybe half an inch or an inch above it. The idea is that steam and gas within the sand are trying to escape. If they find a handy hole, all the better. You haven't got to go mad with these holes, maybe one every 2 or 3 inches. Before the pour, a quick note about temperature. For lost foam casting, the temperature of the metal should be greater than would be necessary for normal lost air green sand casting. This is because the metal has to work harder. If, like me, you can't measure the exact temperature of your metal, just think in terms of getting it as hot as possible. Here's a handy tip for you. If you're using gas or oil to heat your foundry, when you think you're ready to pour, throw in a few charcoal bricks. Add the lid and wait several minutes. The extra heat from the charcoal gives the temperature a turbo boost. So here's the pour, nice and easy thanks to the wide feeder. I don't need to worry about overfilling or spillage, and flame and smoke quickly plume up. Forgive the terrible camera work here, but look at the gases passing through the molten metal. This can only benefit the finished work. And here's the result. At a glance you might think you're seeing defects, but the only imperfections in this metal sprocket are those that were present in the foam pattern. It really is as perfect a pour as I could have hoped for. A lot of the apparent imperfections are just marks created by the process, mostly in the areas where the candle wax and glue were present. I suspect that these are only surface stains, some sort of thin deposit of decomposition products from either the foam or the wax or the adhesive. A quick rub with sandpaper or a file removes these, but I wanted to show you it in its raw state. In truth, I can't do this sprocket justice with a camera. The texture of the foam is evident, and the metal in the areas that were filled with wax are smoother by comparison. It really is a nice job. And the success of this process is all down to 2 things: plaster and a metal spoke. Between these two, the metal is kept hotter for longer. It flows more freely, it completely melts the foam, and it fills the voids, letting out the gas. It couldn't be easier. Now, I'm sure it is possible to get better results. I know professionals employ vacuums, vibration plates, sand compression, and all manner of techniques that aren't easily available to an average guy, but I hope this simple combination of ideas will inspire you to give it a go. If you want to see how easy it is to make these plaster feeders, I'll run through that now. Making the plaster feeder and vent is very simple and only requires a few things to help cast them. I opted for a standard sealant tube, soda cans and a few other bits that were lying around the house. Other than that, it's just plaster of Paris, water and a little time. I found that the sealant tube made a nice feeder size, and in closing it within an ordinary soda can, I could surround it with a reasonable thickness of plaster of Paris. Originally I made flat bottomed feeders, but Martin was able to spot a potential problem with this and suggested a cone-shaped bottom of at least 45 degrees, and that's the only tricky bit to make, to be honest. So I took a chunk of MDF, used a hole saw to cut something roughly the diameter of a soda can, mounted it in my drill press, and with a block and sandpaper tapered the sides. A step drill bored out the inside, and I ended up with something like this. However, we live and learn, and whilst you'll see me using an MDF cone, I'd recommend making one from plaster instead. It's quick, easy to shape, and won't stick to the silicone mould that you're about to see made. Satisfied that the cone was the right size and shape, I built a simple box out of MDF, and again I think ordinary wood would have been a better choice. The lid and bottom were easily made, and I used long bolts to hold everything together. Finally, I made a small cylinder plug that fits the diameter of the cone. The purpose of the plug is to position and hold the cone inside the box, or rather the mould, which is what it really is. I wet everything thoroughly with cold soapy water, then squirted in some ordinary silicone sealant. Soapy water is one thing that silicone doesn't stick to. The problem is, of course, water also swells MDF, hence my recommendation that you use plaster. Make sure there's no gaps between the cone and the walls and bottom of the mould box. Tidy up the silicone a little and leave it 24 hours in a warm, dry place. The following day I trimmed away the excess silicone. I removed the plug from the cone but left the cone in place. I placed a bolt through the top of the lid and covered it in silicone. I wet where I didn't want to stick, then I filled the core of the cone with silicone. I squashed the lid on and added some weight. The lid should have fitted flush, but the MDF cone had swollen. This needed 24 hours to dry. The following day I pulled everything apart and removed the MDF cone, leaving me with this. It's a bit rustic, but it's a surprisingly effective mould. I mixed up some plaster of Paris, added the lid and waited an hour. The result was a crude but usable cone. It needed a little tidying up, but thanks to the mould I can now make as many cones as I need. With the cone still damp, cut away the top of a soda can with scissors and drop the cone inside. I found that the sealant tubes can be awkward to pull free, so I used soda cans again and made some simple sleeves, which are held loosely in place with tape. I added a little PVA for good measure, then inserted the sealant tube nice and centrally. It's then just a matter of pouring plaster of Paris into the gap, hopefully not making as much mess as I do. Half an hour later and everything should pull apart. Getting the soda can off is no easy task, but if you're careful you can peel it like an orange. Don't peel away too much at this stage. I find it helpful to slightly taper the upper edges at this point. You can then slide another can on top, insert the sealant tube and repeat the process once again. Give it half an hour, peel away the top can, chamfer the edges, add more plaster of Paris, and there you go. Eventually you'll be left with something like this. Let it dry ideally for a week and then place it in your oven at a shade over 100 degrees. This should bake off any water. After a couple of hours, turn up the heat to 200 degrees. Apparently there's still water present. The vent is much easier. A chunk of foam makes a nice base. Push a piece of copper pipe into this, then push a piece of plastic waste pipe around that. Notice that I've cut a crude slit in the plastic pipe, which will need to be covered by masking tape or something similar. Plaster of Paris is poured into the gap and the whole thing is left a couple of days as the plaster does swell a little when it's wet, making pulling the copper pipe free tricky until it's shrunk back. And that's it guys, a finished video. I hope you give plaster feeders a try. It's made an incredible difference to the precision of my casting. As always, if you haven't subscribed, please do. If you've got any comments or questions, please drop me a line. So take care guys, and thanks for watching.